Hello there, I'm Bob Bauer. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Warriors Heart USA. We're a faith-based organization, and we are advocates for those in law enforcement and their families that are dealing with PTSD and anxiety issues. We act as a spiritual compass for those that are trying to navigate through life's minefields of traumatic events. We offer free peer-to-peer networks. The one thing that I've learned is that feeling isolated and helpless is a deadly combination when you're battling the lasting effects of a first responder's job. Unfortunately, there are people that don't understand the effects of traumatic stress. They don't understand how it affects a law enforcement officer or how it affects their families. Sadly, every 17 hours there's a police officer somewhere in the United States that is committing suicide. And every 53 hours there's a bad guy who's taking the life of a police officer. So tragically, when you look at those numbers, you see that we are in fact killing each other, killing ourselves faster than the bad guys. And yet, even with those statistics and that data, we have administrators in law enforcement and in the city council halls and the chambers of the county commissioners and supervisors and the legislative bodies across this country that don't believe that there's a problem with traumatic stress in law enforcement. Well, let me tell you something. I know this pain all too well. For a long time, I suffered the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder that came as a result of my time in the military and from the job of being a cop for a number of years. It had its impact on my life in the sense that it was a contributing factor to my marriage ending. Now, when I was 17 years old, I joined the military. In fact, I joined the Air Force to become a security police specialist. It was my childhood dream since the age of 5 to become a policeman. And when presented with the opportunity in the Air Force to become a policeman, I took it. However, after my enlistment ended with the Air Force, I joined the Army, and I became an infantry soldier. I spent most of my time in the Republic of Panama, which is in Central America. And I was stationed there probably during the most contentious times of the country's political history. While I was there, commander of a military overthrew the legitimate government and took over. He appointed himself the head of the military and the head of the government. A couple years later, well, longer than a couple years later, an up and rising military officer in the Guardia Nacional decided he wanted to become the leader. So he arranged for the, I guess you would say, the assassination of the current leader, and he elevated himself to a point of leadership in the government where he took over where that guy he had murdered was at. I can tell you that during my time stationed there, this is probably one of the most stressful times for anyone that was stationed there during that time. Well, at the end of my tour, my overseas tour, I returned to the States. And I was excited when I found out that I was stationed 130 miles from home. It meant that every weekend that I was off, I could drive home, 2-hour drive. I could spend time with my family and my kids. But as soon as my excitement had peaked, it also subsided. As I learned that my father, who was 48 years old at the time, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And then on top of that, my marriage had ended. I was pretty traumatized by those two events, but being a soldier, I had to muster on. Well, then my mom asked me to seek a discharge from the military and come home and help her with my 2 younger siblings. Now, I had a promising career in the military at the time. I was moving up the ranks pretty good. I was very knowledgeable about my job. It had a promising future to it. But at the request of my mother and the obvious need, I requested a hardship discharge and received it. Within a year after getting out of the military, my father died as a result of the brain tumor. Now, within 2 short years, my father had died, my marriage had ended, and I changed jobs. And about the time that my father passed away, I was ending a very toxic relationship. It didn't end well. So all the stressors that someone could face in their life, I was hit with it within a year to 2 year period of time. I just couldn't handle it. So rather than face all these problems, I decided to run away. I quit my dream job being a cop, and I ran away to another part of the country where I found myself penniless, jobless, and homeless, living on the streets. Well, after a while, I was able to get my head on a little bit tighter. I completed my college education and eventually obtained a law degree. But I was still dealing with other factors, and I didn't really know what they were or why. One morning in January of 1994, I woke up in the bathroom floor, found myself curled in a ball, sobbing. I don't know why. I don't know how I ended up there. I don't know why I ended up there, but I knew I didn't want to live. I wanted to die. I wanted everything to end for me right there. My family, I'd been estranged from my family. I was living thousands of miles away from them. I had no contact with them. I felt like my life was completely over. And on top of that, once again, I'm getting out of a toxic relationship. Well, I decided that I needed to find some solace, so I turned to the church, where I became very good friends with the parish priest. He asked me to get involved with the church and invited me to become part of the parish council, where I served as the vice chairman. But even though I was going through all these positive changes, there was still something wrong. I was suffering nightmares, night sweats, hair trigger temper, wasn't eating well. So my friend, Father Tim, suggested I go get a physical, which I did. And as a result of having a service-connected disability, I turned to the Veterans Hospital in Durham, North Carolina, where after a battery of tests, I was determined that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the doctor that I was working with told me at the time they didn't have a prescribed treatment plan for me. However, they did have a list of experimental drugs that they were using with veterans that were dealing with post-traumatic stress, and they would like to use those on me. The effects of these drugs would be sometimes you'd be out of it, unable to function in life. And they would continue using drugs until they figured out which regimen would work. I looked at him and I said, Doc, you do remember what I do for a living, don't you? He said, well, you're going to have to make a choice between your career or the treatment plan. I walked out of Veterans Hospital that day with the intention of taking care of myself. I didn't have the drug treatment plan. Wasn't going to go in the drug treatment plan, but I decided I was going to do what I needed to do for myself. So I studied up on it. I was married a year later, remarried a year later, to a very wonderful woman. And everything was fine in the beginning. I avoided all the trigger events. I didn't go to action-packed movies, war movies, cop movies, movies that blew people up or loud gunshots. I really went to more family-inclined movies. I tried to avoid arguments to the best of my ability. I became very passive in a lot of ways. However, I was still suffering the nightmares. I was still suffering the night sweats. And my temper was beginning to elevate to the point where it was a hair trigger. Well, over the years, I found myself, we had also moved and I got a new job. So, one of the number of things I was doing in order to try and stave off the threat. So anyhow, I moved on, and unfortunately in 2014 when I retired, I was still battling the same issues I was battling in 1994, almost 20 years later. However, this time it cost me my marriage. I ended my career with retirement. I went on to teach. And I decided I wanted to, well, I didn't really decide. I felt a calling that I needed to reach out to law enforcement officers that were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and high anxiety, because I seen the effects of it. I seen the impact. I seen the consequences of it. I was taking things a little lightly, getting my feet wet, trying to figure out how to do it. And then one June morning, I found myself unable to remember where I was the night before. I was unable to form a sentence, and my eyesight was quite blurry. So I went to the emergency room, and after another battery of tests, it was determined that I had a mini stroke. It was at that time I decided I needed to change. So this is one of the reasons why I'm making this video. I wanted to tell you about Warrior's Heart. We're here listening to the very things that I dealt with. We're offering peer-to-peer networks, confidential with empathetic listening. If you find yourself backed in a corner, no place to go, reach out to somebody who will listen. I don't care if you're a family member. I don't care if you're a retired cop. I don't care. If you're battling with anxiety and you think you want to hurt yourself, reach out and ask for help. Warrior's Heart is here to listen. Thank you.